Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that succeeded for one very simple reason. It lied. Better than everything else on the table. It has a name, a colour, and a reputation. What it doesn't have is a fixed formula. Every batch is something different. A new combination of whatever was cheap and available that week, dyed pink and sold under the same name as always. It spread to 17 countries. It made cartel men rich and medical examiners busy, and the only thing consistent across all of it was the colour. Tonight we're tracing how one fake drug became the most glamorous substance in Latin America, and why the less it made sense, the more people trusted it. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes with being handed something at a party and not asking what's in it. Not recklessness, something more social than that. An understanding that the question would mark you as someone who doesn't quite belong here yet. You're at a party in Bogota, not a house party, a real one. The kind that doesn't start until midnight and doesn't end until the city turns a pale grey outside the windows. Music here is something that you feel more than you hear. Rooms full of people who know each other in that specific layered way, where everyone is also connected to everyone else through 3 different events and a complicated history that nobody fully explains to you because you're expected to already know. It's around 2 in the morning. You've been here long enough that the initial awkwardness has dissolved, and you're somewhere in the warm middle of the night where everything feels easier than it did. Sometime around then, someone you half know produces a small bag from their jacket. It's pink. Not the dusty pink of bad lipstick or the aggressive pink of a novelty cocktail. A deep particular pink. The colour of something that was made to be looked at. It sits in the little bag and it catches the light, and the person holding it is smiling the way people smile when they have something they know you want. Tusi, they say. You've heard of it. That's the thing. You've already heard of it, from someone who heard of it from someone else. A chain of recommendations that stretches back through Bogota's social architecture in ways you couldn't trace even if you tried. What you know is this. It's not cocaine. It's something else. Something European and rare and, you've been told, considerably more expensive than cocaine, which is itself not cheap. The name sounds like a code. It kind of is. You're not entirely sure what it does. That is somehow part of the appeal. The powder goes onto a surface. It smells sweet. Faintly chemical underneath, but mostly sweet. Like a candy that's trying to be sophisticated about it. You lean down, and then nothing for a few minutes. That's the first thing. It doesn't announce itself. You're standing talking to someone, and at some point you realise the room has gotten warmer. Not the temperature, just the quality of it. Like someone turned a dial slightly, and the room became a better version of itself. The music isn't louder, but it's more present. It's reaching you in a way it wasn't 5 minutes ago. Your shoulders drop. You hadn't realised they were up. There's an easiness moving through you now. An openness you didn't budget for. The sort of feeling where the conversation you're having seems genuinely interesting rather than something you're performing your way through. The other person's face is vivid. What they're saying appears to matter. You have energy. Real energy. Not the desperate kind, but underneath it, something is also loosening, like a knot you've been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing it was there. You think, oh, this is why people like this. This goes on for a while. Then the floor does something. It doesn't move exactly. It just stops being fully reliable in the way floors usually are. You're still standing. You're still present in the room. But there's a soft distance between you and everything. Like you're watching yourself from one step behind. Following along but not quite inside. The music and the lights and the conversations are all still happening. You're still happening. but the connection between you and all of it has gotten a little loose, a little negotiable. You feel good. That part is real and present and completely unambiguous. But somewhere in the good there is also a drift, a slight decoupling. The room is happening and you are happening, and these two events are related but not as tightly as they usually are. This is, you will learn eventually, there's the ketamine talking. In the bag you are handed, there are at least two things having an argument with each other. One of them is lifting you and making everything feel warm and the conversations feel important. One of them is quietly moving your floor a few degrees to the left. The effect of having both happen at the same time is something between exhilaration and a slow, pleasant bewilderment. You are, in the most technical sense, on a combination of substances you couldn't name if someone asked you to. You don't know that yet. What you know is that you feel remarkably good and pleasantly unmoored, and that the night has gotten better in a way that would be hard to explain to someone who isn't standing here. Someone else arrives with the same pink bag. Later, after the party, after the grey morning, after a day that feels both too long and oddly soft, you try to find out what exactly you took. The internet is not particularly helpful. The people you ask give you slightly different answers. It's basically Tusi, says one person. It's ketamine and ecstasy, says another. It's a new synthetic. It's a European thing. It's a Colombian thing. It's whatever the dealer put in this batch, says a third person, in a way that doesn't seem to concern them as much as it probably should. All of these are partially right. One of them is more right than the others. You won't know which one for a long time. Neither will anyone else. Because that's the thing about this particular pink powder. It was named after a drug it doesn't contain. It calls itself cocaine when it isn't. It borrowed an identity from a compound most people have never heard of, and it's been trading on that borrowed identity ever since. Across 17 countries in 15 years and an unknown number of different formulas. Every batch is different. The pink is always the same. That's the only thing you can count on. In 1974, a chemist named Alexander Shulgin synthesized a compound called 2CB in a laboratory attached to his house in California. Shulgin was a particular kind of scientist, the kind who believed the most important testing environment was himself. He had a proper chemistry background. He'd worked for Dow Chemical in the 1960s and developed a commercially successful pesticide, which bought him enough goodwill that Dow essentially left him alone to pursue his own interests afterward. His own interests turned out to be synthesizing psychoactive compounds and with a small and very trusted group of colleagues carefully taking them. He kept meticulous notes. The compound known as 2CB sat somewhere between two drugs the world already knew. The warmth and sociability of MDMA on one side, the visual alterations of LSD on the other, but shorter in duration than either, and, in the vocabulary of people who spend their time thinking about these distinctions, cleaner, more controllable, at a low dose, friendly and clear-headed, at a higher one, genuinely hallucinogenic in ways that Shulgin described in the careful, appreciative language of someone who had experienced a thing and was trying to write it down honestly. He called it, in his notes, a short-duration, elegant compound. He was not being modest. He was being accurate. For a few years in the early 1980s, 2CB was briefly sold legally in West Germany under the brand name Nexus. Marketed as a therapeutic aid, a legal substitute for MDMA after MDMA was scheduled. Priced, remarkably, at the equivalent of about $1 per dose. The therapeutic window closed quickly once regulators paid attention. By 1995, it was illegal in the United States, scheduled alongside heroin as a compound with no accepted medical use. Shulgin died in 2014. He synthesized hundreds of compounds across a career. 2CB was one of the ones he seemed to particularly like. After scheduling, it went where interesting compounds always go, underground. European rave culture in the 1990s absorbed it, quietly, the way European rave culture absorbed everything eventually. Small quantities in the right pockets. People who knew what they were looking for and knew enough chemistry to ask for it by name. There was a specific type of person, in certain Berlin clubs and certain Ibiza summer seasons, who had tried 2CB and considered it a significant discovery. Not a gateway drug, not a party drug exactly, in the way ecstasy is a party drug. Something more considered, a thing you took when you wanted an experience rather than just a night out. The community of people who tried it was small enough that you could identify yourself to a stranger with a reference to it, and know immediately whether they were in the club, so to speak. It had a reputation. It had a price. It had a mystique built from scarcity and the specific social weight that comes from knowing about something most people don't. What it didn't have was a Colombian distribution network. Not yet. That changes in the late 2000s, not through any organised smuggling operation, not through a dealer who spotted an opportunity and built a supply chain to exploit it. It changes the way most things actually change, which is to say, it changes through tourism. Young, wealthy Colombians travel to Europe. Ibiza in the summer, because Ibiza in the summer is the closest thing the global leisure class has to a shared home. Berlin on a long weekend. London, because London is London, and if you have money it welcomes you warmly and asks few questions. They end up at the right parties. Someone offers them something they haven't tried. They try it. They think, this is extraordinary. They bring a little back. Not much. It's hard to source in quantity. It arrives in small amounts through the post, tucked into checked luggage, passed along through personal connections. A few grams at a time, handled carefully. But it arrives in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Medellin, in the late 2000s, where a particular and insular social world of electronic music and money and high-end nightclubs is already looking for the next thing. Because it is always already looking for the next thing, that is what this world does. And a pink European designer drug that costs more than cocaine and has a name that sounds like a chemical code is definitionally the next thing. The people in those rooms have developed a sophisticated and unspoken vocabulary for status. The cars are one signal. The guest lists are another. The drugs on the table are a third. Not just what they are, but how casually they appear, how little is made of them, how naturally they seem to belong to the evening. A pink powder from Europe that nobody else has yet, that speaks for itself without anyone having to say anything out loud about what it means. Everything that follows begins here. There is one person in particular who sees the gap. His name is Alejandro Montoya. He's from Envigado, a suburb south of Medellin, that has produced across the decades an unusual number of people who end up in the drug trade in one capacity or another. He's in his early 20s, middle class, a regular at electronic music events, at raves, at the kind of after-parties that begin at 5 in the morning in someone's apartment and end when it's already afternoon outside. He's not a chemist. He has no formal training. What he has is contacts and curiosity, and what Colombian journalists would later describe, with a certain generous neutrality, as an empirical approach to synthesis. He gets hold of 2CB through European supply lines. He studies it. He starts making his own version, mixing and adjusting, working by feel rather than formula, testing on himself and friends. And at some point, which the record doesn't precisely capture, he adds pink food dye. Partly to mask the taste, which is sharp and chemical and unpleasant in a way that apparently put people off. Partly one suspects because he was good at this, and a vivid pink powder on a table at a party looks like a statement. He starts giving it away to friends, then to friends of friends. The response is consistently enthusiastic. Then he starts selling it. He names it after the drug it's supposed to contain. In Colombian Spanish, the sounds of 2CB shift into Tusibi, and because Tusibi is a mouthful in any language, becomes Tusi. The name is a phonetic approximation of a chemical notation. Most of the people who will eventually take it will have no idea what it refers to. This will not matter. By 2004, Medellin's underground party world has a rumour running through it. There's a kid selling pink cocaine. By 2007, Alejandro, now known to essentially everyone as Alejo Tusi, moves to Bogotá. He arrives into a world that is ready for him. Bogotá's gilded nightlife in the late 2000s runs on exactly the same logic every capital city's gilded nightlife runs on, which is proximity to the right people in the right rooms at the right hour. There are parties that go for 3 days. There are social circles that overlap in ways that take years to fully map. There are people whose profession, if you ask politely, would be described as something vague involving investment or events or consulting, and who spend a remarkable amount of time in very loud buildings with very good sound systems. Alejo finds his way into these rooms through a connection the investigators later identify only as Maquinita, a young man with his own connections, whose own connections stretched in directions that were profitable and dangerous in roughly equal measure. Maquinita bought from Alejo. Maquinita moved in circles where the pink powder got seen by the right people. The right people told other right people. The price went up. The supply stayed tight. Tusi circulated in Bogotá's top tier as something exclusive, more expensive than cocaine, more interesting, more European. Something that identified you as someone who'd had access to things most people hadn't. How expensive? By 2012, Tusi was wholesaling in Bogotá for up to $43,000 a kilogram. Cocaine at the same moment cost around $1,300 a kilogram. Tusi cost 33 times more, not because it was 33 times harder to make, because the story around it was worth 33 times more than the story around cocaine. Cocaine was what you could get anywhere. Tusi was what you got when you knew people. A Colombian investigator, interviewed years later, described Alejo's early operation in Bogotá this way. He worked alone, sold to everyone, and for protection relied on Maquinita, through whom he'd entered the Bogotá party world in the first place. That arrangement worked until it didn't. In this industry, arrangements tend to work until they very abruptly don't. But here's what was already quietly happening underneath the glamour of it. The actual 2CB was running out. 2CB had never been available in large quantities. It was a niche underground compound produced in small batches in European labs and distributed through specialized channels. Colombian demand, even limited to a few elite social circles, was already straining what could realistically arrive by post and through jacket pockets. Alejo started substituting. A little more ketamine, which was cheaper and more obtainable, some MDMA for the warmth, caffeine to give the powder volume and density. The formula drifted, the name didn't, and nobody said anything. The people taking it still got something. Still got the warmth, the looseness, the pleasant distance. It was close enough to the memory of what Tusi was supposed to be that the gap went unremarked. The name had already started to describe an experience rather than a compound. The drug had quietly separated from its own identity. It just hadn't announced this publicly. By 2010, Tusi has a small but dedicated life in Medellin's elite party world and a growing one in Bogotá. The formula contains almost no actual 2CB. The batches vary depending on what's available and what Alejo, or whoever has taken over a particular corner of production, decides to use that week. The price is high. The supply is controlled. The circles it moves in are small enough that the people inside feel like they know something most people don't. And then Alejo Tusi disappears. The accounts of this don't agree with each other, which is either because the truth is murky or because several different people have reasons to prefer their version of events. One story, Maquinita's arrest exposed Alejo too visibly to keep operating in Bogotá. Another, a crime figure named Chicho Urdinola had him taken, extracted the formula under circumstances that weren't pleasant and forced him out of the market entirely, Erdenola would himself be arrested in 2013. A third version, darker than either, involves an assault involving a cartel figure's relative at a Bogota nightclub, an assault that allegedly happened while the relative was under the effects of Tusi, which made Alejo's continued existence in the city a significant liability. Nobody knows which story is true. Possibly all three contributed. Possibly none of them did. What's known is that Colombian investigators and DEA agents tracking him lose the thread around 2010. He's believed to have fled to Mexico, protected by a figure known only as Alfonchito. After that, nothing confirmed. The man who started Tusi was gone. The Colombian press, with a certain baroque flair, would later call him the Pablo Escobar of synthetic drugs. He would probably have preferred a different comparison, but the point stands. He built something that outgrew him, and then it left him behind. And then a magazine changed everything. In 2012, Revista Semana, Colombia's largest weekly magazine, the kind of publication that sits in doctors' offices and boardrooms and gets passed around family dinner tables and is taken, when it covers something, as confirmation that the thing is real, ran a piece about Tusi. It described the drug. It explained the price. It discussed who was using it. Models, it said. Beauty queens, actors, politicians. The article was written as journalism. It landed as advertising. Every Colombian who read it received the same precise information at the same moment. There is a pink drug that costs significantly more than cocaine, and the beautiful and powerful and connected people of Bogota are the ones who have it. Meanwhile, around the same time, a Colombian police officer was describing a recent drug seizure to a journalist. He called it cocaína rosada, pink cocaine. The name was wrong in two directions simultaneously. It wasn't cocaine. The pink was food colouring. But the name had everything a drug name needs to travel. It was evocative, it was specific, it sounded glamorous and slightly dangerous and familiar enough to understand at a glance. The journalist ran it. The press ran with it. And Tusi now had two names. The insider term that implied European sophistication, and the press term that implied something even better, forbidden glamour. Both names were wrong. Both names were perfect. A sociologist named Julian Quintero, who would spend years studying Tusi and the culture around it, described the Semana Effect with particular precision. It became an object of desire. People believed that by consuming this substance they could belong, or at least appear to belong, to elite circles. Demand didn't gradually increase, it spiked. And the story we follow from here, the cartels, the labs, the 17 countries, the bodies and the testimonies and the headlines, all of it traces back to that one moment. A magazine, a photograph, 4 categories of aspirational people. Someone read that article and decided they needed to find out where you get Tusi. They were not the only one. And it involves a price war, a formula theft, and 8 people who died in Cali over the right to sell a drug that didn't contain the drug it was named after. The Colombian drug trade operating with its usual quiet understatement. Julian Quintero, a sociologist who'd been tracking Colombia's synthetic drug scene for years, watched what happened next with the specific discomfort of someone who had predicted it. It became an object of desire, he said. People believed that by consuming this substance they could belong, or at least appear to belong, to elite circles. This is not, it should be said, a uniquely Colombian phenomenon. This is just how aspirational consumption works. The same mechanism that sells luxury watches and table service at nightclubs also sells drugs. The product is almost beside the point. What you're really buying is the story of the kind of person who has this. Tusi had that story in abundance, more expensive than cocaine, harder to find, favoured by models, politicians, beauty queens, a name that sounded like a code, a colour that looked like nothing else on the table. But here's the thing that happened alongside the Semana coverage that almost nobody talks about. Around the same time, a Colombian police officer was describing a recent drug seizure to a journalist. He wanted to explain what they'd found. He reached for a description and called it cocaína rosada, pink cocaine. The name was wrong in two directions simultaneously. It wasn't cocaine, the pink was food colouring, but the name had everything you need a drug name to have. It was familiar, glamorous, slightly forbidden, and immediately understandable to anyone who heard it. The journalist ran it. The press ran with it. And Tusi suddenly had a second name, a press name, one that implied something even more compelling than the insider version. This was cocaine, but better. More exotic. More dangerous. Pink. So in the space of a few months, Colombia's most widely read magazine had accidentally created a marketing campaign for an exclusive drug, and the National Police Force had accidentally created a brand name for it. Demand didn't climb. It arrived all at once, and supply, for the moment, couldn't come close to keeping up. Here is what was happening inside that gap between demand and supply, and why it matters. Tusi, at this point, was still a relatively boutique operation. A handful of producers in Bogotá and Medellín, working in small batches, selling into specific circles through personal connections. The formula varied by batch. The prices were extraordinary. The whole thing functioned less like a drug trade and more like an exclusive luxury goods market. Limited runs, word-of-mouth distribution, pricing that conveyed status rather than reflecting cost. Then the Semana article ran, and suddenly people who had never moved in those circles wanted in, not eventually, immediately. The economics of what followed are straightforward and quietly insane. When demand outpaces supply in a legitimate market, prices go up until supply catches up. When demand outpaces supply in a drug market, something different happens. Everyone who can make the product starts making the product. Immediately, without quality controls, without consistent formulas, without the relationships and the trust and the careful curation of the original operation. Picture what this actually looked like at street level. Someone in Bogotá's second-tier nightlife hears about Tusi, wants to sell it, has access to ketamine and some MDMA. They add food dye. They put it in a bag. They charge what they've heard Tusi costs, because the name is what the customer is paying for. The customer receives something pink, takes it, gets an effect that is broadly in the right territory, and goes home satisfied. The cycle repeats. Nobody along that chain lied exactly. Nobody told the customer the product was something it wasn't. The name Tusi had already, within a few years of its existence, become a description of a category, a pink powder in this general effect range, rather than a specific formulation. The market had quietly agreed to this redefinition without anyone formally announcing it. What was being sold as Tusi in Bogotá's second and third tier nightlife by late 2012 was increasingly whatever someone had been able to mix in the previous 48 hours. The name stayed the same. The powder stayed pink. Everything else was negotiable. The gap between what Tusi was supposed to be and what Tusi actually was had been wide from the beginning. Now it became a canyon. The people who benefited most from the Semana moment were not, in any meaningful sense, the people who built Tusi. They were the people who had the infrastructure to scale. The Urabeños, one of Colombia's largest and most powerful criminal organizations, operating out of the northwest of the country, with connections running through virtually every corner of the national drug trade, identified Tusi as a product worth controlling. They had the distribution networks that Alejo had never had. They had labs that didn't rely on one empirical chemist working out of an apartment. They had, crucially, the capacity to move product across the country without having to worry about who Maquinita knew. They moved in. The Machos Crime Group, a partner organization operating primarily in the Valle del Cauca region, moved in alongside them. A leading figure in the Machos operation was arrested in Pereira. Investigators, going through his operation, believed they were looking at Colombia's largest distributor of synthetic drugs. The scale of what he was running bore no resemblance to the small operation Alejo had built. Between these two organizations, Tusi went from a Bogotá nightlife curiosity to a nationally distributed product in roughly 18 months. Macho's refined Tusi was now selling simultaneously in Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, Cartagena, and Barranquilla. 5 cities, one name, no consistent formula. The drug that had been defined by exclusivity was now being manufactured at cartel scale. The magazine article had opened the door. The cartels had walked through it and immediately started knocking down walls. There is a very specific absurdity at the centre of all this that is worth sitting with for a moment. The cartels had gone to war, not metaphorically but actually, over the rights to produce and distribute a substance that had no fixed recipe. There was no formula to steal, no secret ingredient to protect, no proprietary process to guard. Anyone with access to ketamine, MDMA, caffeine and pink food dye could make Tusi. The equipment required was, in the most technical sense, a kitchen and a bowl. What the cartels were actually fighting over was the name, the brand, the story around the pink powder, the right to put their version of the product into a market that had been trained to want it, which is, if you think about it for a moment, exactly what luxury goods companies fight over. Nobody sues over the fabric. They sue over the logo. Nobody goes to court over the leather. They go to court over the interlocking letters on the clasp. The Colombian drug trade had accidentally reinvented trademark law. There's a line from an Insight crime investigation that captures this perfectly. Tusi, a source told them, is the Coca-Cola of drugs. Not because of the chemistry, because of the brand recognition. You see the colour, you know the name, you know the price point. The product inside the bottle has changed. The bottle is the point. Somewhere in a business school, a marketing professor is using this as a case study, or they should be. The Urabeños, as criminal organisations tend to do when things are going well, developed an internal disagreement. By October 2014, one faction within the organisation had apparently decided that the Tusi trade in Cali was profitable enough to be worth operating independently, cutting out the other faction entirely and establishing a separate distribution network. The logic was simple. Why share the margin when you could keep the whole thing? The other faction had a different view. 8 people were killed in the resulting purge. 8 people died in Cali over the right to sell a drug that didn't contain the drug it was named after, under a name invented by a police officer who got the chemistry wrong, because a magazine had published an article about it 2 years earlier. The violence was entirely real. The product that caused it was in some fundamental sense a fiction. This is the particular quality of Tusi's absurdity. It generates very real consequences for a very fake product. The bodies in Cali were real. The grieving families were real. The crime scene reports were real. And the thing at the centre of all of it was pink food dye and ketamine in a bag with a borrowed name. The Colombian drug trade had, in this moment, achieved something genuinely new. People were killing each other over a brand. To be clear about the scale of what was at stake, Tusi, at its peak wholesale price of $43,000 a kilogram, represented extraordinary margins on a product that cost almost nothing to make. The Macho's distributor arrested in Pereira was moving volume across 5 cities simultaneously. The money was real even if the formula wasn't. When you're operating at that scale, a faction trying to cut you out of your own supply chain is not a business dispute. It's an existential threat. The violence follows the logic of the economics, not the logic of the product. That's what makes the Cali Purge the defining moment of this chapter of the story. It's the point where Tusi's fictional nature became irrelevant to the real-world consequences it was generating. The drug didn't need to be real for the money to be real, and the money, at cartel scale is always reason enough. Meanwhile, a different kind of problem was developing in the labs. The cartel scale production of Tusi had accelerated something that was already quietly happening: the complete divorce of the formula from any relationship to 2CB. By 2013 and 2014, Colombian harm reduction organisation Cabeza was testing samples from across the country. Their findings were consistent and conclusive. 95% of what was being sold as Tusi contained no 2CB whatsoever. What it contained instead: ketamine, MDMA, caffeine, and a rotating cast of whatever else, was available and affordable. Some batches had methamphetamine, some had synthetic cathinones, some had opioids. In a few cases, local anaesthetics like lidocaine appeared, presumably added to give the powder a numbing effect that users would associate with quality. Some batches had mescaline, apparently added by producers who considered it a premium touch. Every batch was genuinely different from every other batch, and the people buying it had, by this point, largely stopped expecting otherwise. Here is the thing that Cabeza documented carefully. Dealers had developed an explanation for the variability, and it worked. The pitch, delivered with apparent sincerity to customers who asked questions, was that 2CB was not a single molecule but a mixture of different substances. This is false. 2CB is a precisely defined chemical compound. It has a specific molecular structure. It has a specific name. Shulgin wrote it down in meticulous detail, but it was a persuasive lie, delivered confidently, in the context of a market where nobody had the equipment to check, and it had the additional advantage of reframing the variability as sophistication. Your Tusi is different from my Tusi because the formula is complex and multidimensional and artisanal, really. That's not adulteration, that's craft. The customers accepted this, more than accepted it. Some of them began requesting specific versions. Call your dealer, ask for a more sedating batch. Call back next week, ask for something more stimulating. The idea of customized Tusi, a drug with no formula being ordered to specification, was not a joke. It was an actual practice that harm reduction workers documented across multiple Colombian cities. The drug market had invented bespoke. While all of this was happening at the top of the market, something different was happening at the bottom. The democratization of Tusi inside Colombia was not a single event. It was a slow, multi-year descent through social strata. Elite nightclubs first, then mid-tier venues, then everywhere else. And each step down the ladder brought the drug into contact with a different culture, a different sound, a different context. By 2015 and 2016, Tusi had arrived at reggaeton events, at Guaracha concerts, at the kind of music that doesn't require a guest list or a private table or a European connection to access, just a ticket and a Friday night. Guaracha, for those unfamiliar, is a Colombian subgenre, fast, psychedelic leaning, built for dancing in ways that blur the line between movement and disorientation. It's loud in a very specific way. It asks things of the body that other music doesn't, and it turns out, for reasons that in retrospect seem obvious, that a drug combining stimulation and dissociation and mild hallucination is an extremely good match for music that was already doing those things sonically. Tusi started appearing in Guaracha and reggaeton culture, referenced in songs, in the imagery around the music, in the scenes where it played. The drug and the music built a relationship that reinforced each other. The music made the drug feel culturally embedded, and the drug made the music feel like the right soundtrack for what your body was experiencing. This is how subcultures adopt substances. The chemistry fits the context. The context validates the chemistry. Both spread together. By 2013, Tusi was already appearing at music events in Medellin and Bogotá, priced at around $40 a gram. Still a premium, still signalling something, even if the thing it was signalling was no longer quite I know the right people in Europe. By 2016, it was at every kind of social event. The price was still falling. The signal had shifted again. Now it signaled something more accessible. I know where to get this. I'm the person in this room who has it. The aspiration had democratized too. The status was the same. The exclusivity was just cheaper now. A trafficking group operating under the name L'Esprit, 18 members, organized, using air shipments, was arrested by US and Colombian authorities in April of that year. Their operation had been distributing Tusi to 5 foreign countries simultaneously: the United States, Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. This is the moment the story becomes international. But here is the thing about that moment that makes it different from every previous drug export operation in Colombian history. What L'Esprit were exporting was not primarily the product, it was the concept. Think about how cocaine export works. You grow the plants in Colombia, you process them in Colombia, you move the finished product across borders. The geography matters because the product is tied to specific agricultural conditions. You can't just recreate cocaine in Poland from local ingredients. Tusi is not like that. In each of those 5 countries, Tusi didn't need to keep arriving from Colombia to keep existing. It only needed to arrive once. Local dealers in Panama or Lima or Santiago could look at what they'd received: a pink powder, ketamine and MDMA at its base, food dye giving it the colour, and work backward to a recipe. Ketamine was available in those markets. MDMA was available. Pink food dye was available at every grocery store on Earth. The manufacturing could happen anywhere. The brand could travel without the product. Joseph Palomar, an epidemiologist who would later study Tusi's spread in the United States, would describe this with a precision that makes the whole thing land differently. Tusi is not just being imported as a drug, it's the importation of an idea. Once the idea was out, there was no mechanism for containing it. You can intercept a shipment of cocaine. You cannot intercept a concept. The arrest of L'Esprit removed 18 people from the supply chain. It did not remove the recipe, the name, the colour, or the market appetite that had been building for 3 years across 5 countries. Those things were already local in each destination market. They didn't need Colombia anymore. Law enforcement had spent decades building systems designed to interdict plant-based drug supply chains. Those systems carried one core assumption: the drug lives in the product. Stop the product, you stop the drug. Burn the fields, seize the shipments, arrest the traffickers. The product has to travel. You can catch it in transit. Tusi had quietly broken that assumption entirely. The drug lived in the idea. The product, that specific pink powder, was almost incidental. What mattered was the knowledge that such a thing existed, that it was called Tusi, that it was pink and sweet-smelling and associated with Colombian nightlife and European designer chemistry. That knowledge, once arrived, was sufficient. Local chemistry, local MDMA, local ketamine, local food dye. Done. The arrest of L'Esprit was a real enforcement success. It was also structurally beside the point. Chile was the first country where this became a documented reality at scale, and where the gap between the name and the contents was put on record in a way that left no room for interpretation. When researchers in Chile began testing samples submitted as Tusi or 2CB, the results were stark. 99% of submissions said to contain 2C contained ketamine. Less than 1% contained any 2C series compound at all, not one sample in 100. The product had travelled 5,000 kilometres from its origin city, been locally reproduced by people who had never met Alejo Tusibi or his original formula, and arrived in Chilean nightclubs as something completely different from what its name described, while retaining exactly the name, the colour, and the reputation of the original. The brand had travelled perfectly. The drug had not travelled at all. This is worth pausing on, because it represents something genuinely new in the history of illicit substances. Most drugs degrade through the supply chain. They get cut, diluted, adulterated. Less of the original compound arrives at the final consumer than left the production lab. The product weakens as it travels. Tusi went the opposite direction. The concept strengthened as it moved. Each new market received the full mythology, the glamour, the exclusivity, the European origins, while the actual chemistry became more variable and unpredictable than ever. The story travelled without friction. The molecule travelled without any effort at all because nobody was really moving the molecule anymore. Back in Colombia, around this same time, the police were doing their bit to help. In 2013, Colombia's National Police Director gave an interview in which he stated with apparent confidence that Tusi was in the process of replacing cocaine as Colombia's dominant drug export. This was not true. Cocaine remains Colombia's defining drug export by a margin that makes the comparison almost embarrassing. The Tusi market at its peak was a rounding error on the cocaine balance sheet. But the police director said it, the press reported it, and the effect was identical to what the Semana article had produced the previous year. Another round of national coverage, another wave of public interest, another cohort of Colombians who had now been informed by an official government source that Tusi was the new big thing. The police, in trying to warn the public about a drug, had produced the most effective advertisement for that drug since the original Semana piece. Colombia's law enforcement community had, entirely inadvertently, become Tusi's most reliable marketing department. They have not to this day received credit for this contribution. They probably wouldn't want it. Argentina arrived the same way and played out almost scene for scene the same script as Colombia 3 years earlier. Buenos Aires in the mid-2000s received Tusi through Colombian criminal connections, initially circulating in specific electronic music clubs in the Palermo neighborhood and along the waterfront. The entry mechanism was social and careful. Word passed through trusted networks, meetings arranged a week in advance, prices set at roughly 3.5 times the cost of standard cocaine. The people who noticed other clubgoers in that particular state, the warmth, the easiness, the slightly loose relationship with the floor, wanted to know what that was. They asked. They were introduced to someone. They arranged a meeting for the following week and paid the premium. The Buenos Aires press covered it in roughly the same register as Semana had covered it in Bogotá. A glamorous import, favoured by people who know things, not widely available, expensive for a reason. A product that had been moving quietly through specific social circles suddenly had an audience of readers who now knew what they were missing. The violence followed the same script too. In 2012, the same year as the Semana article, the same year the Bogotá market was exploding, a Colombian paramilitary figure named Jairo Saldarriaga was killed in Buenos Aires. Colombian press connected his death to competition over Tusi supply routes. The drug had been in Argentina for less than 3 years. It had already generated its first murder. The price held for a while, then it started to drop, then it dropped some more. By the time a gram of Tusi in Buenos Aires cost what a gram of cocaine cost, the cycle had completed its first full turn outside Colombia. The elite phase, the media phase, the democratization, 3 to 5 years from first appearance to mass market, identical in pattern to what had happened in Bogotá. The next country would take roughly the same amount of time. There were already 12 countries in the sequence. While all of that was spreading outward, something darker was accumulating at home. The variability problem, the thing Echele Cabeza had been documenting for years, was no longer just an inconvenience. It was becoming a safety issue in ways that were harder to wave away than inconsistent potency. A toxicologist named Dr. Jorge Alonso Marin, working at the Soma Clinic in Medellin, began seeing patients who had consumed Tusi and presented with something that didn't fit the standard ketamine and MDMA clinical picture. Something more aggressive, something the standard response protocols weren't built for. Two of his cases pointed in a direction that made harm reduction workers deeply uncomfortable. A Medellin dealer, operating under the alias Calavera, which translates as skull, a choice that tells you something about his personal brand strategy, gave an interview to the Colombian newspaper, El Espectador. In it, he confirmed what the clinical cases had suggested. He personally added fentanyl to his Tusi preparations, not accidentally, not as contamination from a shared supply chain, deliberately. Fentanyl is approximately 50 times stronger than heroin. In a powder with no fixed formula, consumed by people who believed they were taking something psychedelic and party-friendly, in quantities they had no means of calibrating, this is not a design feature. It is an instrument of accidental overdose. Calavera either didn't understand this consequence or didn't particularly care, which in practical terms produces the same outcome. What makes Calavera's admission particularly significant is what it tells you about the structural incentives of the market he was operating in. Tusi had no fixed formula and no quality standard. There was nothing preventing him from adding whatever he chose. There was no oversight, no testing requirement, no mechanism by which a customer could detect what was in their batch before consuming it. In a market built entirely on trust and branding rather than chemistry, a dealer who adds fentanyl is not doing something categorically different from a dealer who swaps out MDMA for a synthetic cathinone or adjusts the ketamine ratio. He's just varying the formula, the same way everyone varies the formula. The difference is that fentanyl at the wrong dose kills people in minutes. Harm reduction workers noted that fentanyl had not yet appeared widely in their tested samples. Calavera appeared for the moment to be an outlier, a data point that didn't yet represent a trend. The phrase, "for the moment," was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, and everyone who wrote it knew it. 2 years after Los Pri were arrested, after Tusi had arrived in 5 countries and set the democratization cycle in motion across South America, the price in Colombia hit $15 a gram, down from 100, down from 40, $15 for a powder that a cartel had killed 8 people to control. A dealer in Medellin, interviewed years later, described the situation with the flat precision of someone watching an asset they once believed in lose its value. It is no longer an elite drug. It is in all social strata. At first, yes, because of its high cost and the magic of secrecy. Now everyone knows the recipe. There is no secret anymore. The price has gone down. The quality has also gone down. In Colombia, the country that invented Tusi, that had built an entire mythology around it, that had men dying over distribution rights, the drug was now essentially generic. The exclusivity was gone. The mystique was gone. The glamour had moved on to the next market that hadn't run the cycle yet. In Spain, Energy Control, the country's main drug testing organization, received a handful of Tusi samples in 2019. By 2022, they would receive 150. Europe had noticed, and Europe, as it turned out, was about to run the whole sequence again, faster, louder, and with considerably better Instagram coverage. It started in Ibiza, in August, when 13 kilograms of pink cocaine turned up alongside 440,000 euros in cash and a submachine gun, the usual summer essentials. Spain had been watching this from a distance for about a decade. The first confirmed Tusi seizure in Spain was in 2011. A handful of samples over the following years, then a notable bust in 2016. 9 people arrested, a few of them Colombian, operating a Tusi lab outside Madrid. That one made the news briefly and then disappeared. The drug existed at the margins, associated with Colombian nightlife, connected to specific immigrant social networks, not something Spanish drug authorities had built vocabulary for yet. Most European drug agencies at this point had never encountered the product. Their systems were built around specific scheduled compounds. Tusi didn't map cleanly onto any of them. It wasn't cocaine, it wasn't MDMA, it wasn't ketamine. It was all three, or some of them, or something else entirely depending on the batch. The paperwork was a nightmare. The drug just kept being pink. Then the world stopped. Lockdowns have an underappreciated pharmaceutical legacy. When you tell an entire continent it cannot go to nightclubs, bars, music festivals, or any other space where people gather in large numbers and make decisions they'll regret, you create pressure. And pressure, when released, tends to release with interest. In Spain, that release began in 2021. The nightlife that came back was not cautious. It was not restrained. It had been waiting 18 months, and it returned with the specific energy of something that had been cooped up too long and was now compensating. Venues that had been dark for a year and a half opened to crowds that were visibly, enthusiastically relieved to be there. The Ibiza summer season of 2021 was, by multiple accounts, extraordinary. The 2022 season was louder still. Tusi was waiting for exactly this moment. It arrived in Spanish nightlife the way it had arrived everywhere else, through a specific social layer first, then spreading outward. But Spain had something Colombia and Argentina hadn't had quite as strongly, a direct Colombian connection built across decades of immigration, trade, and a shared language that made it considerably easier to move product, establish trust networks, and build distribution channels without the friction of translation. Spanish and Colombian organised crime had been doing business together for years. The cocaine trade had built those relationships. Tusi simply travelled the same infrastructure. By the time anyone was paying close attention, it wasn't a Colombian import problem anymore. It was a Spanish domestic production problem. The first major lab bust outside Madrid had been in 2016. By 2022, Spanish police were finding labs in apartment kitchens. The components were no secret: ketamine, MDMA, food dye, and they were available locally in every destination market. Someone in Madrid could look at what was arriving from Colombia and decide it was simpler to source everything locally and mix it themselves. The arrest of a Colombian and a Spanish man running a Tusi lab outside Madrid in May 2022 was, in this context, entirely predictable. The Spanish police called it a pink cocaine lab. The occupants would have called it a kitchen with additional equipment. The Ibiza bust of August 2022 is worth describing in some detail, not because it was uniquely dramatic, but because it captures the whole situation in one image. Spanish police found 13 kilograms of what they called pink cocaine on the island. Alongside it, regular cocaine, ketamine, 440,000 euros in cash, and a submachine gun. 12 people arrested, most of them British, 2 of them Colombian, 13 kilograms. That's not someone's personal supply, that's a distribution operation, the kind of operation that has calculated demand across a season and stocked accordingly. The kind of operation that has clients who know to ask for it by name, venues that know where to send people, and a network established enough that you'd bring a submachine. Gun to the storage location for the same reason any serious business operation might bring one. Because the inventory is valuable and the insurance market doesn't cover this category of goods. The British-Colombian composition of that room tells you exactly how the supply chain had evolved. The Colombian side provided the connection to the original supply network, the contacts, the credibility within a specific distribution world. The British side provided the Ibiza infrastructure, the club relationships, the tourist-facing networks, the knowledge of which venues moved product and which didn't. 2 countries, 1 table, 13 kilos of pink powder that was mostly ketamine. That same summer, something else was happening. A rumour spreading across Ibiza's social networks that a batch of Tusi had been laced with fentanyl. Overdoses were happening, the rumour said. People were getting badly hurt. It wasn't true. The fentanyl rumour deserves a moment because it's instructive about how Tusi's information environment works. Energy Control, Spain's leading drug harm reduction organization, which tests samples submitted by users and festival goers, went through their Ibiza area samples carefully. No fentanyl. The Loop, the UK harm reduction organisation that runs drug checking services at festivals, found nothing either. Other testing organisations reported the same. The rumour was false. But here is what the rumour's spread tells you. In a market defined by the complete absence of reliable information about what's in the product, false information travels at exactly the same speed as true information, because nobody has a mechanism for telling them apart. A Tusi user on Ibiza in the summer of 2022 could not look at their bag of pink powder and determine whether it contained fentanyl. They could not test it quickly enough for the result to matter. They could not call a number that would give them a definitive answer. The only information available was word of mouth, and word of mouth is shaped by whoever said it first and amplified by whoever found it most alarming, and distributed by social networks that have no interest in accuracy as a governing principle. The false fentanyl scare spread across Ibiza in hours. The correction from harm reduction organisations spread more slowly, reached far fewer people, and was considerably less exciting as a thing to share. The drug that had built its reputation on being unknowable was now unknowable in a way that made people nervous rather than intrigued. People who would have been excited to try the exclusive European drug were now, understandably, less certain. The word fentanyl does something to a conversation that pink cocaine doesn't, even when it's not there. For what it's worth, fentanyl in Tusi remains a documented but not widespread risk. The Ibiza rumours were false. The Colombian case of the dealer Calavera, who admitted deliberately adding it was real and documented, lab testing. Organisations in most markets have not found fentanyl consistently in their samples. For what it's also worth, that situation can change, and when it does, it will probably change quickly. Across the water in mainland Spain, the numbers were telling a cleaner story. Energy Control's survey of 1,412 recreational drug users in 2022 found that 1 in 5 reported using Tusi in the prior 12 months. 1 in 5. That's a mainstream penetration rate, comparable to what MDMA achieved at its European peak. In a country with a mature, well-established drug market that already had cocaine, cannabis, MDMA, and ketamine doing very good numbers. Before 2019, Energy Control had received a handful of Tusi samples in total. By 2022, they had received 150. The director of the organisation, Claudio Vidal, delivered an assessment that punctured the mythology more efficiently than any police press conference had managed. He said, contrary to the belief that pink cocaine is a drug of the elites, used by models and rich people, this product is being used by people from every level. The elite era of Tusi had lasted exactly as long as it always does, until the next tier of the market arrived and the pricing adjusted accordingly. In Madrid you could find it for €80 a gram, in London £80, still a premium over cocaine in most markets, but no longer the extraordinary luxury it had been in Bogotá in 2012. The story was still there. The price of the story had dropped. In some areas of Spain, Tusi had acquired a new nickname, the chic drug. The irony of calling it the chic drug in 2022, when the Colombian market that invented it was selling it for $15 a gram, and anyone with access to ketamine and a food colouring section could manufacture it, is exactly the kind of irony that Tusi generates effortlessly and perpetually. Everywhere Tusi goes, it is new and glamorous and exclusive, until it isn't, and by the time it isn't, it's already started being new and glamorous and exclusive somewhere else. What Energy Control was finding inside the samples was telling its own story. Almost all of them contained ketamine. Most also contained MDMA. Those two had been the consistent base for years, but the Spanish samples were showing something the Colombian samples had shown earlier. The ketamine concentration was increasing over time, not dramatically, gradually, but consistently. The explanation is straightforward and not flattering to anyone involved. Ketamine is cheaper than MDMA. As Tusi's price came down to meet a broader market, producers adjusted the formula to maintain margins. Less MDMA, more ketamine, same pink colour, same name, same price at the point of sale. The customer was buying a name and a colour. What was inside the bag was a separate question, one the colour had never been designed to answer. This matters pharmacologically because ketamine and MDMA produce very different experiences at different ratios. A batch heavy in MDMA feels like warmth and connection and energy. A batch heavy in ketamine produces dissociation, sedation, a loosening of your relationship with physical space. At high enough ketamine concentrations, it produces what users call a K-hole, a complete departure from ordinary consciousness that can last minutes or hours and is not, by most accounts, what anyone expected to get from something marketed as a glamorous party drug. Users arriving expecting one experience were receiving another. The gap between expectation and reality was widening. The consequences of that gap depended on what else was in their system that night, and how much they'd taken, and how their body handled ketamine specifically, and whether there was anyone nearby who knew what was happening if things went wrong. There often wasn't. Ketamine at a high dose is a sedative. It produces profound dissociation. A person in a K-hole is not unconscious. They're present in a sense, but entirely removed from any accurate perception of their physical environment. They cannot reliably assess height, or danger, or the edge of something. They cannot make decisions about their body's safety in any meaningful way. This is not a theoretical concern. The Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner documented 8 deaths between 2020 and 2024 involving coloured powders labelled Tusi. All 14 of the powders tested contained ketamine. Most also contained MDMA. Some contained opioids. One of the accidental deaths in the case series was classified as a fall from height. A fall from height. In a drug whose ketamine content was quietly, consistently increasing, in a market where nobody knew exactly what ratio was in their bag, that outcome is not a mystery. It's a consequence. This is what happens when you build a product around branding rather than chemistry. The brand is stable. The chemistry drifts in whatever direction costs least, and the gap between what the customer thinks they're buying and what they're actually receiving gets quietly, consistently wider. The United Kingdom was watching the Spanish numbers with the particular attention of a country that has historically taken a close interest in Ibiza's drug supply, and whose nationals had been showing up in Spanish drug busts with increasing frequency. By 2022, Tusi had been detected at a UK music festival. It had been reported in Austria and Switzerland. Not widespread, not yet a domestic story with its own headlines, but present enough that harm reduction organisations were beginning to add it to their public information materials, not because it was everywhere, but because the pattern, at this point, was thoroughly legible. They'd seen what happened in Colombia. They'd seen what happened in Argentina. They could read a trajectory. Before moving to what happens next, the Spain numbers deserve a direct statement. Energy Control survey of 1,412 recreational drug users in 2022 found that 1 in 5 reported using Tusi in the prior 12 months. 1 in 5. In a country with a mature, well-established drug market that already had cocaine and cannabis and MDMA doing very strong numbers. Before 2019, Energy Control had received a handful of Tusi samples in total. By 2022, 150. The director Claudio Vidal said it plainly. Contrary to the belief that pink cocaine is a drug of the elites, used by models and rich people, this product is being used by people from every level. Although at the beginning it was found mainly in big cities like Madrid or Barcelona, or touristic locations like Ibiza, today it has spread to other cities. Other cities, not just the ones in the documentaries, the ones in between. A nightclub staffer working Ibiza that summer gave Mixmag an interview and asked to remain anonymous, which seems entirely reasonable. Tusi was everywhere, she said. It was just like any other drug. She described the two-tier pricing she'd observed, around 140 to 150 euros a gram at the top end, 80 euros at the lower end. She'd tried the cheaper version herself. It had no head high, she said. It's got a nice flavour though. It goes up nice. No head high. Nice flavour. Goes up nice. A description that tells you almost nothing about what you actually took, delivered with the relaxed confidence of someone who has decided the specifics don't particularly matter. It's worth sitting with why people decide the specifics don't matter. It's not stupidity. It's the same logic that applies to any market built on trust and branding. When you buy a product with a recognizable name and consistent appearance, you're not running a laboratory analysis every time. You're trusting the brand. You're trusting that this pink powder is the same category of thing as the last one. In a pharmaceutical context, that trust is enforced by regulation and liability. In the Tusi market, it is enforced by nothing. The guarantee is a colour, and a colour cannot tell you whether today's batch has twice the ketamine of last week's, or whether something new has been added, or what is going to happen to your nervous system in the next hour. The staffer didn't know what she took. The people around her didn't know what they took. They were fine with that. This is the Tusi consumer experience in its most concentrated form. By late 2022, Tusi was arriving in the United States in a new way. Not for the first time. It had been detected in scattered US seizures since 2015. But arriving differently now, arriving as a product with a story, arriving in nightlife scenes that had already been primed by social media coverage of the European summer circuit, by references in music and celebrity culture, by a general awareness that this pink thing existed and was associated with a specific kind of glamour. In January 2023, a man was arrested in New York City carrying a backpack. The backpack contained 10 pounds of pink powder. The powder was submitted for laboratory analysis. It was pure ketamine, no MDMA, no other substances, just ketamine, dyed pink, sold under a name that implied something entirely different. The man was in the business of selling a concept. The concept was pink. The substance was ketamine. The price difference between the two is significant and entirely real. The DA noted that in the US, Tusi was predominantly being manufactured locally rather than imported. Dealers were doing what dealers in Chile and Argentina and Spain had done before them, receiving the idea, sourcing the components locally, adding the dye. The concept had arrived before the product. The product assembled itself from whatever was available. Of 960 pink powder seizures by the DEA since 2020, 4 contained actual 2-CB4 out of 960. The drug, whose entire identity rested on its association with a specific compound, contained that compound in fewer than 0.5% of American samples. Bridget Brennan, New York's special narcotics prosecutor, described the particular danger clearly. Cocaine, she explained, is a stimulant. People who take cocaine have certain expectations about what will happen. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. It does the opposite. It can put people into a K-hole where they feel like they're in a blank space, like they are disassociated from their body. They're disassociated from their brain. They don't know what's going on. People expecting cocaine were receiving ketamine. People expecting a glamorous European designer drug were receiving an anesthetic used in operating rooms and veterinary clinics, one that, at the wrong dose, produces complete detachment from physical reality. Epidemiologist Joseph Palomar, surveying New York's nightclub scene, estimated that around 2.7% of electronic dance music venue attendees reported Tusi use in 2024. He had a line about the colour that captures the whole story in one sentence. If it weren't a pink powder, I don't think it would be this popular. The colour was always doing all the work, and it was still pink. None of this had yet broken through to mainstream public consciousness in the way that would make Tusi a household name. Harm reduction workers knew about it. Festival safety organisations knew about it. Drug journalists had written about it. But it remained a subcultural story. That changed in October 2024. It changed because of a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires and a name that the entire world already knew. Liam Payne, former member of One Direction, one of the most commercially successful pop groups of the 2000s, a man who'd been globally famous since he was 16 years old, fell from the third floor of the Casa Sur Palermo Hotel in Buenos Aires on the 16th of October, 2024. He was 31 years old. The minutes before his fall had been recorded in the bureaucratic way that all crises now get recorded, by the hotel's emergency call log, by security cameras covering the corridors and lobby and street outside. A staff member had called emergency services. A guest was intoxicated with alcohol and drugs, they said. He had been destroying objects in the room. They were afraid of what might happen. "We need someone sent to us urgently," the caller said. Because, well, I don't know if he is at risk. The guest is in a room that has a balcony, and, well, we are a little afraid that he might do something life-threatening. Emergency services arrived minutes after the fall. Payne died at the scene from injuries sustained on impact. The autopsy found 25 injuries compatible with a fall from height. The cause of death stated formally, multiple trauma, internal and external hemorrhage. The prosecutors noted that the absence of defensive injuries on his hands was consistent with having been unconscious or semi-conscious when he fell. Preliminary toxicology reports, attributed to anonymous sources by multiple international outlets, including ABC News and TMZ, stated that Payne had pink cocaine, Tusi, among multiple substances in his system, alongside cocaine, crack and benzodiazepines. International media, which had spent a decade largely ignoring Tusi as a subcultural Latin American phenomenon, ran the story everywhere. Every major outlet filed an explainer. Every explainer started roughly the same way. What is pink cocaine? In the space of 48 hours, Tusi went from a drug that required explanation to a drug that everyone had heard of. In November 2024, Argentine prosecutors released the official toxicology findings. The results showed alcohol, cocaine, and a prescribed antidepressant. Not Tusi, not pink cocaine, not ketamine and MDMA. The official report did not confirm the substances that the preliminary anonymous reports had attributed to his system. 5 people were eventually charged in connection with the case. A hotel employee alleged to have supplied cocaine to Payne during his stay. His personal companion, another supplier. The hotel receptionist who made the emergency call. The hotel manager. Charges range from negligent homicide to supply of controlled substances. Legal proceedings were ongoing at the time this story was written. Payne's death was real. The grief of his family was real. The circumstances, a deeply intoxicated person left alone near a balcony in a hotel room, were real, and they are a documented recurring pattern in nightlife culture globally. The legal accountability being sought was real. What was not real was the pink cocaine. The correction was reported. It travelled less far and less fast than the original story. It was mentioned in a paragraph inside articles that led with the initial reports. It didn't generate its own news cycle. The drug that had always been defined by the story around it had generated one final demonstration of exactly that principle. A story that travelled faster than the facts, and further, and arrived to more people, and was remembered longer. Somewhere in all of this, Alexander Shulgin's careful, precisely documented compound is at about 12 degrees of removal from the event with which it will forever now be associated. The compound is still there, in the footnotes, correctly identified as something Tusi does not contain. The pink is what everyone remembers. The other major story of late 2024 arrived differently, through a courtroom rather than a hotel balcony. Sean Combs, the record producer and music industry figure known as Diddy, whose federal trial became one of the more closely watched legal proceedings of that year, was the subject of testimony that included Tusi among a list of substances. A former assistant describing their duties in the job testified that part of the work had involved procuring and maintaining a supply of narcotics for events. The testimony described a role that included apparently knowing what to order, knowing where to get it, and knowing how to have it available at the right moment. Tusi was one of the items on the list. The case was about far more serious allegations. It would be wrong to make Tusi the centerpiece of what that trial was about. But Tusi appearing there, in that specific context, in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, described as a fixture of entertainment at a certain level of American celebrity culture, completed something that had been building for 12 years. Tusi had started as the drug of Colombia's elite. Not global elite, Colombian elite. The models and beauty queens and politicians of Bogotá in 2012. It had then travelled through every subsequent tier, the mid-range Colombian market, the South American expansion, the Spanish nightlife scene, Ibiza in the summer. And now it was appearing in testimony about what circulated at the very top of American music industry culture. The aspiration cycle had run its complete circuit. Consider the journey. Medellin in 2004, a young man from Envigado handing something pink to friends at a rave. Bogotá in 2012, the Semana article describing it as what the elite do. Cali in 2014, 8 people dead over the right to sell it. Santiago, Buenos Aires, Panama, Madrid, Ibiza. A Manhattan nightclub survey, a federal courtroom. The product had changed with every step. The ketamine ratio had shifted. The MDMA content had varied. Fentanyl had appeared in at least one batch. New adulterants had come and gone. No 2 grams had ever been exactly the same. The name had never changed. The colour had never changed. And the aspiration, the specific, consistent aspiration to belong to wherever Tusi had arrived most recently, that had never changed either. The drug was now in New York and Miami and Los Angeles and the nightclub circuits of 4 continents. The price varied from $15 a gram in Colombia to £80 in London. The contents varied from pure ketamine to a complex mixture of stimulants and dissociatives to, in documented cases, something that could kill you if the ratios were wrong or the wrong thing had been added. But the colour was always the same, and the question that was now presenting itself to American harm reduction workers, to American emergency rooms, to American parents who had just Googled something they didn't know, the name of a week ago, was exactly the same question that Colombian harm reduction workers had been asking since 2012, and that Chilean researchers had documented in their lab data, and that the nightclub staffer in Ibiza had answered without quite meaning to. What exactly is in this thing? The answer, as ever, depended entirely on when you asked and who made it. And there was no way to know that from the outside. There never had been. Here is where Tusi is right now. In Colombia, the birthplace, it costs $15 a gram, down from $100, down from $40. $15 for a powder that 8 people died over in Cali a decade ago, that a national magazine turned into a status symbol, that a generation of young narcos built their identity around. $15. In London, £80. In Madrid, €80. In Sydney, where Australian police seized 133 kilograms between March and July of 2024 alone, The price is still climbing because the market is new enough to support a premium. In New York, it circulates in the nightclub scenes of Manhattan, while the DEA files reports and epidemiologists try to figure out how many people are consuming it without realizing it's primarily ketamine. The drug is everywhere. The drug has never existed. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and that is not a paradox. It is just how Tusi works. The cycle is predictable now. 17 countries have run it in sequence. A new market receives the concept through a Colombian connection, through social media, through a traveller who encountered it in Ibiza and brought the idea home. The elite phase begins, expensive, exclusive, restricted to specific circles, covered by the local press as a glamorous import. Then the price drops. Then it's everywhere. Then the next market receives the concept and begins the elite phase again. In the time it takes you to read this, Tusi is probably in its elite phase somewhere new, a city whose harm reduction workers haven't encountered it yet, a nightlife scene where nobody has built vocabulary for it, a social world where someone is producing it from a bag and the room is deciding collectively that the question of what's in it doesn't need to be asked. The regulatory problem deserves a moment because it is genuinely strange. Tusi itself is not scheduled under the United States Federal Controlled Substances Act. There is no compound called Tusi. You cannot schedule a colour. The components, ketamine, MDMA, methamphetamine, opioids, are separately scheduled at various levels. But a bag containing pink food dye and caffeine is not technically a controlled substance. A bag containing pink food dye and caffeine and a Schedule III substance is a different legal category, but that determination requires laboratory confirmation, which requires a lab, which requires time. Law enforcement who encounter it must test it before they know what crime, if any, has occurred. The pink colour tells them nothing legally actionable. The DEA has been building cases around the components, not the brand. But the brand is what's spreading. The brand is what people are buying. The brand is what dealers are selling in new markets every month. You can arrest 18 members of Los Pri and disrupt a supply chain. You cannot arrest the concept they were distributing. The concept replicates independently in each new market, assembled from whatever is locally available, held together by food dye and a name that most users can't trace back to its origin. The surveillance problem is quieter and possibly more consequential. Most major drug surveys, the ones governments use to understand what their populations are consuming, the ones that inform policy and treatment and funding, do not include Tusi as a named category. A user who consumed Tusi last month and is now completing a drug survey will find no box for it. They might check ketamine, because they later learned that's what was primarily in it. They might check MDMA. They might check cocaine if the batch contained it. They might check nothing that accurately reflects what they took, because no category applies. Joseph Palomar at NYU documented this in his New York nightclub data with uncomfortable precision. Roughly 42% of people who reported Tusi use underreported their ketamine use. They took ketamine inside a product called Tusi and did not register themselves as ketamine users because they were Tusi users. Different category, different product. Except the ketamine was there and the ketamine was doing everything ketamine does, regardless of what the bag was called. The result is that global surveillance estimates for ketamine, MDMA and cocaine are all affected by Tusi's existence in ways nobody has fully mapped. The drug that doesn't exist is distorting the data used to understand the drugs that do. When researchers try to understand whether ketamine use is rising, some of the rise may be Tusi. When they try to understand MDMA trends, some of the data is Tusi. When they try to understand cocaine patterns, some of what they're measuring is Tusi, a product that contains no cocaine and never did. Researchers studying this problem have noted a historical parallel that is not encouraging. In the 2000s and 2010s, the popularity of MDMA, sold under the street name Molly, marketed as pure MDMA but frequently adulterated with synthetic cathinones and other compounds, created a similar data distortion. Self-reported MDMA use during that period almost certainly overstated actual MDMA use and understated use of the adulterants. Studies and treatment programs built on those surveys systematically underestimated the scale of the synthetic cathinone problem. Tusi appears to be running the same pattern, except with more substances, higher variability, and a more compelling brand that makes users even less likely to suspect the contents differ from the name. The International Narcotics Control Board has recommended expanding drug checking services and improving surveillance systems specifically because of this data problem. The recommendations are good, the resources have not arrived, and in the meantime, the data that policymakers use to allocate treatment funding, design harm reduction programs, and respond to emerging drug trends contains a systematic blind spot in the shape of a pink bag. Australia had its first police seizure of pink cocaine in 2020. By March through July of 2024, a 4-month window, Australian Federal Police seized 133 kilograms. That escalation curve is familiar to anyone who's been following the story from the beginning. Medellin ran it, Bogotá ran it, Buenos Aires ran it, Santiago ran it, Madrid ran it. Now Sydney and Melbourne are running it. Drug checking services in Australia began issuing alerts about pink powders containing ketamine and MDMA. In one case, documented by the CanTest Harm Reduction Service in Canberra, a user submitted a sample they had purchased as 2CB. The sample contained Tusi. The user had been told they were buying a specific documented psychedelic compound, first synthesized in 1974. They were buying the concept. In another Australian alert from 2025, testing services found pink-coloured powders at a festival containing ketamine and MDMA with additional substances. The pattern was consistent with what Colombian and Spanish testing had been showing for years. The concept arrived in Australia before the public health response. It always does. That's not a failure of the Australian system specifically. It's the structural condition that Tusi creates in every market. The brand travels faster than the awareness of what the brand actually contains. By the time the harm reduction materials are printed, the users have already formed their opinion of the product. Here is what the drug checking data actually shows, compiled across Latin America, Europe, and the United States through 2024. Of 68 samples submitted to Erowid's drugs data program between 2016 and 2024, under labels including Tusi, 2CB, or pink cocaine, 94% contained ketamine, 81% contained MDMA. Smaller percentages contained cocaine, methamphetamine, synthetic cathinones, opioids, benzodiazepines, DMT, and antihistamines. In Chile, 99% of samples claim to contain 2C contained ketamine. Less than 1% contained any 2C series compound. In Colombia, across fixed sites and festival testing throughout the country, ketamine and MDMA present in the majority of samples, with a rotating supporting cast that varied by region and by year, including in some samples mescaline, methamphetamine, oxycodone, tramadol, MDA, synthetic cathinones, lidocaine. In Spain, Energy Control's decade of data shows a consistent ketamine MDMA base, with increasing ketamine concentration over time and variable additions depending on the batch. In Miami-Dade, 14 powders tested across 8 deaths. All 14 contained ketamine, 13 contained MDMA, 5 contained cocaine, some contained opioids, benzodiazepines, synthetic cathinones, and over-the-counter antihistamines. Not one sample, anywhere, reliably contained what the name said it contained, not one. The compound Tusi is named after it appeared in fewer than 1% of American samples. The cocaine in Pink Cociane appeared in only some. The only thing present in every sample, across every database, across every country, was the pink. The fentanyl question remains open. It was documented in isolated cases. A Medellin dealer who admitted it deliberately. 2 clinical cases confirmed at a Colombian hospital. Reports in Canada of ketamine seizures with fentanyl contamination, raising the question of whether Tusi category products were among them. But widespread systematic fentanyl in Tusi had not been confirmed as of the most recent comprehensive testing data available. The Miami-Dade case series found none. European drug checking services found none consistently. American DEES seizures had not flagged it as a pattern. This is the situation that experienced harm reduction workers describe with the specific unease of people who know how these trajectories work. Fentanyl contamination in other drug categories went from rare and isolated to routine and mass casualty in the span of a few years. The mechanism was the same in each case: cost efficiency, absence of quality control, no detection capacity at the consumer level. In a market with no formula to protect and no mechanism for customers to test what they've received, the only barrier to adding fentanyl is the dealer's own judgment. Calavera's judgment was not a barrier. For now is not the same as not a problem. Currently is doing a lot of work in the sentences that contain it. There is a question that harm reduction workers began asking around 2023 and that nobody has answered satisfactorily. What does Tusi look like in 5 years? The trajectory across every market that has run the full cycle suggests the same answer. More of the same, in more places, at lower prices. The brand doesn't lose momentum from negative coverage. The Liam Payne story, even though the official toxicology didn't confirm Tusi, generated more global awareness in a week than a decade of public health warnings had managed. The Diddy trial placed it in the vocabulary of American pop culture. The Ibiza seizures made it a British tabloid story. Every round of coverage generates new awareness. New awareness generates curiosity. Curiosity generates demand. Demand generates supply. Supply generates the next round of coverage. There is no external force that breaks this cycle. The cycle has only ever ended in a specific market because the market became fully saturated. When the elite mystique evaporated, the price collapsed to commodity level, and everybody knew the recipe and nobody was impressed by the colour anymore. In Colombia, that took about 15 years. In Spain, it is still in progress. In the United States, it is in early stages. In Australia, it appears to have just begun. Each new market enters the cycle at the elite phase, runs through the democratization, and exits at commodity level. The drug then moves to the next market that hasn't seen it yet. There is currently no shortage of markets that haven't seen it yet. The drug that started as nothing, a fake version of something, a name borrowed from a compound that wasn't present, a colour added to mask a taste, has achieved a kind of permanence that most real pharmaceutical compounds, with patents and clinical trials and regulatory approval and quality control, never manage. It cannot be recalled. There is no manufacturer. There is no central supply. There is no responsible party. There is just the idea, travelling, replicating, dressing itself in whatever the local market has available. Still pink. Always pink. The legal status of Tusi varies by country in ways that produce outcomes that would be genuinely funny if the stakes were lower. In the United States, the powder itself may not be illegal. Its components are. A bag of pink food dye and caffeine is not a controlled substance. A bag of pink food, dye, caffeine and ketamine is a Schedule III substance. But that determination requires laboratory confirmation, which requires sending the sample to a lab, which takes time, during which the person holding the bag may or may not be detained depending on the jurisdiction and the officer's read of the situation. The DEA has been building cases around the components rather than the brand. But the brand is what's spreading. You can prosecute the ketamine. You cannot prosecute the pink. In the United Kingdom, the Misuse of Drugs Act schedules by compound. Tusi doesn't appear. Its ketamine content makes it Class B. Its MDMA content makes it Class A. Which classification applies to the bag depends on which compound the prosecution chooses to lead with, which depends on the lab result, which can take weeks. A bag of pink powder is, pending laboratory analysis, simultaneously a Class A and a Class B controlled substance, which is a sentence that most legal frameworks were not designed to accommodate. In Colombia, synthetic drug legislation has been updated multiple times, specifically to address the Tusi market. The approach has been to schedule the components and the precursor chemicals used to make them. It has slowed the larger operations. It has not stopped production. When the formula has no fixed ingredients, there is always an ingredient to substitute. The International Narcotics Control Board listed Tusi in its 2022 report and recommended expanding drug checking services, improving precursor chemical monitoring, and developing public education campaigns, clarifying that pink cocaine is not related to cocaine and Tusi is not related to 2CB. All sensible recommendations, all dependent on sustained funding that most governments have not committed at the recommended scale. The drug does not wait for the funding cycle. Here is what the drug-checking data actually shows, compiled across Latin America, Europe, and the United States through 2024. Of 68 samples submitted to Erowid's Drugs Data Program between 2016 and 2024, under labels including Tusi, 2CB, or pink cocaine, 94% contained ketamine. 81% contained MDMA. Smaller percentages contained cocaine, methamphetamine, synthetic cathinones, opioids, benzodiazepines, DMT, and antihistamines. In Chile, 99% of samples claimed to contain 2C-contained ketamine. Less than 1% contained any 2C series compound. In Colombia, across fixed sites and festival testing throughout the country, ketamine and MDMA present in the majority of samples, with a rotating supporting cast that varied by region and by year, including in some samples mescaline, methamphetamine, oxycodone, tramadol, MDA, synthetic cathinones, lidocaine. In Spain, Energy Control's decade of data shows a consistent ketamine MDMA base, with increasing ketamine concentration over time and variable additions depending on the batch. In Miami-Dade, 14 powders tested across 8 deaths. All 14 contained ketamine, 13 contained MDMA, 5 contained cocaine. Some contained opioids, benzodiazepines, synthetic cathinones, and over-the-counter antihistamines. Not one sample, anywhere, reliably contained what the name said it contained. Not one. The compound Tusi is named after appeared in fewer than 1% of American samples. The cocaine in pink cocaine appeared in only some batches. The only thing present in every sample, across every database, across every country, from the first Echele Cabeza testing in Colombia to the most recent Miami-Dade case series, was the pink. The data is unambiguous. The name is a fiction. The colour is the only truth the product consistently tells about itself. Alejo Tusi, the man from Envigado who started this, who mixed the first batch in his apartment, who added the food dye and handed it to his friends at a rave in Medellin sometime around 2004, has not been heard from by authorities since approximately 2010. Colombian press called him the Pablo Escobar of synthetic drugs. He would probably have preferred a different comparison. He's believed to be in Mexico, protected by a figure known only as Alfoncito. After that, nothing confirmed. 3 different versions of why he left exist. One involving the arrest of his associate Maquinita, one involving a kidnapping by a cartel figure who reportedly extracted the formula and forced him out of the Bogotá market, one involving an assault at a nightclub that made his continued presence in the city a significant liability. None of the three has been definitively confirmed. Nobody who knows the real version has elected to share it with journalists. The product he created, or more accurately, the product that replaced the products he created while keeping its name, is now in at least 17 countries. It is circulating in nightclubs on 4 continents. It is the subject of DEA fact sheets and UNODC reports and peer-reviewed papers in the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry, the Journal of Forensic Sciences, and the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. Epidemiologists at NYU are writing grant proposals about it. Medical examiners in Miami are building case series. Harm reduction organizations across Latin America, Europe, and Australia have developed public-facing materials about it in multiple languages. His alias, Alejo Tusi, gave the drug its name. The drug kept the name. He did not keep the drug. This is, in miniature, the entire story of Tusi. The person who starts something loses it quickly. The name persists. The colour persists. Everything else is renegotiated continuously by whoever has the supply chain this week, in whatever city they happen to be operating in. The Medellin man who started it is invisible. The drug he started is visible in 17 countries. That is also, in miniature, how most things work. Alexander Shulgin synthesized 2CB in 1974 and described it in his notebooks with the care and appreciation of someone who had found something genuinely interesting. He published everything. He believed these compounds deserved documentation, deserved understanding, deserved the kind of serious scientific attention that controlled substance scheduling, made very difficult to obtain. He was a particular kind of scientist. He had a proper chemistry background. He'd worked for Dow Chemical in the 1960s and synthesized a commercially successful pesticide that bought him enough institutional goodwill to pursue his own research afterward. His own research turned out to be synthesizing psychoactive compounds and with a small and very trusted group of colleagues, carefully taking them. He kept meticulous notes. He published 2 books, Pichkal and Tikal, that read like guided tours of human consciousness, rendered in careful scientific language, with a warmth underneath that suggested he found the whole project genuinely wonderful. He synthesized hundreds of compounds across his career. He tested each one on himself before sharing it with anyone else. He believed that direct experience was more honest data than theory, and he was willing to be the experimental subject of his own curiosity for decades. 2CB was one of the compounds he seemed to particularly value. He described it as sitting between the warmth of MDMA and the visual quality of LSD, but shorter and more controllable than either. He called it, in his characteristic terms, a short duration, friendly, low-caloric psychedelic. He died in June 2014 at age 88 in his home in Lafayette, California. His lab was still attached to the house. His notebooks were still meticulous. By the time he died, the compound he had synthesized and so carefully described was being impersonated across South America by a pink powder made primarily of ketamine. The impersonation had been running for roughly 6 years. It had generated cartel violence, a national media phenomenon in Colombia, and an aspirational consumer trend spreading internationally. The product sold under his compound's phonetic name was none of the things he had described. It was not short duration in any predictable way. It was not friendly in any guaranteed sense. It was not a psychedelic in most batches. It was whatever was cheapest and most available that week, dyed pink and sealed in a bag with a borrowed identity, being sold to people who had no idea who Alexander Shulgin was, or that they were using his compound's name to buy something he never made. He kept meticulous notes. He would have had thoughts about this. The notes are still there, in a house in California. Here is the complete accounting. What Tusi is: a brand. The brand consists of a colour, a name, and a set of associations: glamour, exclusivity, European origins, Colombian nightlife, that have been maintained, migrated, and refreshed across 17 countries and 2 decades without ever being attached to a consistent product. The brand was built accidentally, amplified by a magazine that thought it was doing journalism, given its most recognisable name by a police officer who got the chemistry wrong, and distributed globally by a mechanism that required no central organisation and no fixed formula. What the colour is: pink, always. This is the only specification that is held across every batch, every country, every year. The pink colour was added originally to mask the harsh taste of a compound that is no longer present. The taste it masked is gone. The colour remains. What is underneath the colour, whatever a particular producer decided to use in a particular batch in a particular city on a particular week. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases, ketamine and MDMA. In some cases, additional stimulants, opioids, sedatives, synthetic cathinones, local anaesthetics, caffeine, and very occasionally the compound the whole thing is named after, which appears in fewer than 1% of American samples. What the name promises: 2CB, a specific and documented psychedelic first synthesized in 1974 by a California chemist who described it with care and published his findings honestly. What is present? Almost never 2CB. What the name implies: cocaine, a plant-based stimulant with a century of documented history and consistent pharmacology. What is present? Almost never cocaine. What is always present? The pink. That is the full specification. That is the entire product. That is what every market it reached, and 20 years of spread, and 8 people dead in Cali, and a national media phenomenon in Colombia, and cartel purges, and celebrity coverage, and federal court testimony, and public health warnings, and medical examiner case series, and academic papers, and Ibiza summer seasons, and a Manhattan nightclub survey, and an Argentine hotel balcony, and a set of meticulous California notebooks have all been organised around a colour, specifically food dye, added to a powder one afternoon in Medellin because it looked better that way. Something happened in Colombia around 2016 that nobody writing about Tusi quite anticipated. The customer started placing orders, not orders in the sense of buying from a dealer, orders in the sense of specifications. Consumers began calling their suppliers and requesting particular versions of Tusi, adjusted to personal preference, customized to the evening's needs. I want something more sedating. Can you make the next batch more stimulating? Something more psychedelic this time. Harm reduction workers documenting this practice described it with the careful neutrality of people who had encountered something they genuinely hadn't seen before. A drug with no formula was being ordered to specification. The dealer would adjust the ratios: more ketamine, less MDMA, a different cathinone substituted in, perhaps something more for the psychedelic component, and deliver it as the requested version. Whether what arrived matched what was asked for, there was no way to verify. The customer had no testing equipment. The dealer was working from intuition and availability, but the customer had made a choice. The customer felt like a participant in the product's creation. The customer was, in some strange sense, a collaborator in the design of their own evening. This is the moment Tusi stopped being a drug and became a service. The young men selling it had never thought of themselves as chemists. They thought of themselves as nightlife professionals. They operated in the specific social world of Colombian club culture, Bogotá, Medellin, Cali, where Tusi had become embedded in the music scene so thoroughly that it was practically a genre accessory. Reggaeton had adopted it. Guaracha had adopted it. The The drug and the music had built a relationship over several years that reinforced each other in the way that drugs and music always do. The music made the drug feel culturally native, and the drug made the music feel like the right soundtrack for what the body was experiencing. Both spread together through the same social channels. Julian Quintero, the sociologist who'd been studying Tusi since its elite days, watched this new generation of producers with the precise attention of someone documenting an anthropological phenomenon in real time. What he saw was not the old cartel structure, not the Urabeños, not the machos, not the large criminal organizations that had taken over the market in 2012 and 2013. What he saw was something smaller, more personal, more culturally native to nightlife itself. These were young men who had grown up with Tusi as a fixture, who had taken it before they sold it, who understood their customer base because they were their customer base, who considered the product theirs in a way the cartel operators never had, because the cartel operators had treated it as merchandise, while these men treated it as a craft. They customized the product. They developed reputations for specific formulas. They added individual touches, sometimes a logo pressed into the packaging, sometimes a particular ratio they'd found through trial and error worked well for a specific music scene, sometimes a signature addition that regular customers came to expect. One producer might be known for a batch that leaned heavily stimulant, perfect for long nights with up-tempo music. Another for something more dissociative, preferred by people who wanted to float rather than dance. Another for something that had a pronounced psychedelic quality, mescaline or a synthetic cathinone added in, giving it a visual dimension that customers specifically sought out. The drug market had invented craft production. The artisanal movement, which had been transforming food and beverage culture in cities globally for years, had arrived in Tusi. The language was the same: specific sourcing, individual attention to product, building a loyal customer base around recognizable quality. The ethics were somewhat different, but the economic logic was identical. Quintero put it precisely. With Tusi, anyone can be a young man playing a drug trafficker. The teenage gangster culture has been democratized. This was not only about the buyers performing a social identity, it was also about the sellers. The young man with a reputation for good Tusi was not a cartel operator, not a dangerous criminal in the traditional sense, not someone who had climbed through years of violence and institutional loyalty. He was a nightlife figure with a brand and a customer base, and a product that people specifically sought him out to purchase. He had all the status markers of the old narco culture, the mystique, the connections, the product people wanted, packaged into something that could be run from a phone and a kitchen, and a network of regular clients who texted when they needed a batch. The old glamour had democratized, and the people inheriting it had no idea that what they were selling contained none of the thing it was named after. The harm reduction organizations had been watching all of this for years, trying to build a response to a product that redefined itself faster than any response system could keep up with. Echele Cabeza in Colombia had been testing Tusi samples since the early days of the phenomenon. By 2023, they had tested the largest number of samples in a single year since they'd started. Their analysis that year found something that had remained consistent throughout the decade. 65% of samples contained the ketamine MDMA combination at their base. The remainder contained variations, additional substances, different ratios, the occasional surprising inclusion. What this data showed was not a product. It was a population of products, each individual sharing only a name and a colour. Energy Control in Spain, running the same kind of drug checking, found broadly similar patterns over their decade of data. The ketamine MDMA base as the consistent core, with the ketamine concentration increasing over time as prices fell and producers substituted the cheaper component upward. The specific pattern of increasing ketamine, a trend that had not been present in early samples, was the direct consequence of the price pressure that comes with democratization. As Tusi became a mass-market product, the economics of its production shifted toward the cheaper components. In the United States, harm reduction researchers at NYU were running saliva tests on nightclub attendees alongside self-reported drug use surveys. The results confirmed what the Colombian and Spanish data suggested. A significant proportion of people who had taken what they believed was ketamine or MDMA separately were in fact consuming Tusi, or vice versa, or neither. The categories were bleeding into each other in ways that drug monitoring systems hadn't been designed to detect. Bridget Brennan, New York's special narcotics prosecutor, described the specific problem facing harm reduction workers in the US context. It can put people into a K-hole where they feel like they're in a blank space, like they are disassociated from their body, they're disassociated from their brain, they don't know what's going on. She was describing the effect of a drug most of her city's nightclub attendees thought was something else entirely. Drug checking as a practice was the only honest answer to the epistemological problem Tusi had created. It told users, for a specific gram of powder on a specific night, what was actually in front of them. It was not a solution. It was a partial mitigation of an unsolvable problem. A user who tested their Tusi before taking it knew what that particular gram contained. They did not know what the next gram would contain. That gap between what testing can tell you and what you actually need to know to be safe is the permanent condition of Tusi. It cannot be closed by any amount of drug checking. It can only be closed by knowing who made it and when, which in an illegal market with no accountability and no fixed formula is information that is never reliably available. The only truly safe assumption about any given pink powder is that it contains at least ketamine and at least MDMA. Everything else is variable. The ratio is variable. The additions are variable. Whether it was made carefully or carelessly is variable, including, on some documented occasions, whether it will kill you. The conversation about Tusi that harm reduction workers have been having since roughly 2018 is a conversation about a specific uncomfortable truth. The product is not going away, not because of any failure of law enforcement, or any failure of public health messaging, or any failure of drug policy specifically. It's not going away because it was never a product in the sense that enforcement frameworks were built to address. It is an idea, an aesthetic, a cultural object that happens to produce a pharmacological effect, the specifics of which are determined separately in each transaction by a different producer using different components in a different city. You can seize a shipment, you can dismantle a lab, you can arrest a distributor. All of these things happened to Tusi, Los Pri in 2015, the Madrid labs in 2016 and 2022, the Ibiza Hall in August 2022. Each seizure was a real enforcement success. None of them reduced the global availability of Tusi by any measurable amount, because the next producer, in the next city, in the next country, needed only to know that such a thing existed, and that it was pink, and that people would pay for it. That knowledge was freely available. It spread through social networks, through club culture, through the simple observation that someone next to you at a party had a small pink bag and seemed to be having a very good time. The idea travelled faster than any enforcement response could move. It always will. What did people actually buy when they bought Tusi? This is the question that sits underneath all the data, underneath the lab results and the seizure statistics and the medical examiner case series. What were they actually purchasing? A chemical effect, obviously. Ketamine plus MDMA in some ratio, with variable additions. That part is documented and real, but that's not all they were buying. A person in a Madrid nightclub in 2022 was not primarily paying for ketamine and MDMA. They could have purchased ketamine and MDMA separately in known quantities from established suppliers for less money. They didn't. They bought the pink powder. They were paying for the story. They were paying for the name Tusi, which sounded like a code, which implied chemical sophistication, which connected to a Colombian nightlife world that was itself connected to a European designer drug world that almost nobody in the Madrid nightclub had actually accessed. They were paying for the colour, which was beautiful and distinctive and unlike anything else on any surface in any nightclub. They were paying to be the kind of person who has this. That is not a trivial thing to purchase. Human beings have always paid premiums for the experience of social identity. The watch that communicates reliability. The restaurant that demonstrates the kind of person who knows about restaurants like this. The drug that signals you move in circles where this is the drug. These are not irrational purchases. They serve real social functions. The social identity is the product, and people pay willingly and substantially for the social identity. Tusi offered a specific social identity, sophisticated, connected, cosmopolitan, insider, at a price point that was, for most of its history and most markets, substantially higher than cocaine. Not because it was harder to make, because the story was worth more than the chemistry. The pink colour was the communicative device. It said, across a room, without any words, "I have something special here. Do you know what this is?" Almost everyone wanted to know what it was. Almost nobody who asked received accurate information, because the person offering it frequently didn't know. The person who made it sometimes didn't know. The system had been running on partial information from the beginning, from the first batch Alejo made in his apartment, where he was working from feel rather than formula, testing on friends, adjusting until the response was enthusiastic. The entire Tusi market from 2004 to the present has operated on a shared assumption that everyone involved knows more than they actually do. The customer assumes the dealer knows what's in it. The dealer assumes the producer used a consistent formula. The producer assumes their choice of ingredients will produce the effect they intend. None of these assumptions is reliably true. All of them feel true. The pink makes them feel true. The name makes them feel true. The social context makes them feel true. And feeling true in an unregulated market with no verification mechanism is sufficient. The story of Tusi is, in the end, a story about a product that succeeded precisely because it understood something true about its market, before the market understood it about itself. People do not primarily buy drugs to feel a specific pharmacological effect. They buy drugs for the same reasons they buy everything else, for social belonging, for identity signaling, for the feeling of being the kind of person who has access to this particular thing, for the story they get to tell, to themselves and to the people around them, about who they are and what they know and where they've been. The pharmacological effect is real. The warmth from the MDMA and the drift from the ketamine and the slow, pleasant bewilderment of having both at once. Those are real things that happen to real bodies in real rooms. They are not nothing. They are, for many people who have taken Tusi, genuinely pleasant experiences. But they are not sufficient on their own. If they were sufficient on their own, any generic combination of ketamine and MDMA would sell as well as Tusi. It wouldn't need the name. It wouldn't need the colour. It wouldn't need the story of the Colombian nightclub and the European chemist and the models and politicians who had it first. It needed all of that. The name and the colour and the story were not marketing added on top of a product. They were the product. The ketamine and MDMA were the delivery mechanism for the thing people actually wanted, which was the experience of being inside the story. And the brand in this case was Pink. The drug-checking data, compiled from every testing service that has submitted samples over the past decade across every country where Tusi has been documented, tells a story that has been remarkably consistent. Almost all samples contain ketamine. Most also contain MDMA. The ratio varies, the additions vary, the concentrations vary. The ketamine percentage has trended upward over time as prices have fallen and cheaper. Bulking has become more economically rational. The Tusi that the name promises, present in fewer than 1% of samples globally. The cocaine that the press name implies, present in a minority of batches. The pink colour, present in 100% of samples. Always, every batch, every country, every producer, every year since Alejo Tusi added food dye to a powder in a Medellin apartment around 2004 because it looked better that way. 20-something years of global drug market evolution, cartel violence, celebrity coverage, regulatory confusion, public health emergencies, academic papers, federal court testimony, an Australian police seizure of 133 kilograms in a 4-month window, 17 countries and counting, and the only thing that has never changed, the only specification that has held, the only truth the product has consistently told about itself. Pink. Somewhere right now, and this is not a metaphor, this is a statement of fact based on documented trajectories and documented markets. Tusi is in its elite phase in a city you haven't thought about in this context. A city where the price is still high because the market is still new, where the press has just run the local version of the Semana article, where the supply is tight enough that having access to it means knowing someone, where the harm reduction workers are still building vocabulary for it. In 3 years, the price will have dropped. In 5, it will be available at every tier of the nightlife scene. In 10, the Colombian dealer's line will apply. Everyone knows the recipe. There is no secret anymore. The price has gone down, the quality has also gone down, and by then, the brand will have moved again. To the next city, the next country, the next social world where it arrives as something new and exotic and exclusive and not quite identifiable, where someone produces a small bag from a jacket, where the bag is pink, where someone who has already heard of it, because they've always already heard of it from someone who heard of it from someone else, leans down, where the room gets warmer, not the temperature, just the quality of it. The compound Alexander Shulgin described with such precision and care, short duration, friendly, low caloric, is not in the bag. It was never reliably in the bag. It stopped being in the bag before anyone outside a handful of Colombian nightclubs had heard of it. What's in the bag is something else, something variable, something whose ratio was decided by someone whose primary constraint was what was available and affordable that week. Dyed pink because the pink is what sells it, carrying a name that references a compound it doesn't contain, traded under a press name that references a drug it also doesn't contain, moving through a market that runs on a shared pretense that everyone involved knows more than they do. And the feeling arrives, and the feeling, that particular feeling of being the kind of person who has the thing in a room where having the thing means something, that is exactly what it was always selling. The colour is still pink, the notebooks are still in California, neither of them is going anywhere. Here is what Tusi taught the drug market, unintentionally and without anyone meaning to draw the lesson. Branding works better than chemistry, not as a general principle, not in medicine, where the compound is the product and the compound has to do what it says, not in regulated markets where there is accountability for what's in the package and liability for what happens when it isn't, but in an unregulated market where there is no enforcement mechanism for product consistency and no legal liability for misdescription and no consumer protection mechanism of any kind. In that market, a compelling aesthetic and a good story will outperform a precise formula every time. The precise formula is only necessary if someone is going to check. Nobody was checking. Nobody had the equipment to check. So the formula became irrelevant, and the aesthetic became everything. Tusi is the purest expression of this principle the drug market has ever produced. Not because anyone designed it that way. No one sat down in 2004 and decided to build the world's first pure brand-based drug. Alejo was just adding food dye because it looked better, but the conditions were exactly right. No formula to begin with, a distinctive visual identity, a name with built-in mystique, and a market of consumers who were primed to want something exotic and exclusive and didn't have the tools to verify whether they were getting it. The pink food dye was not an afterthought. The pink food dye was the whole product. Everything else was filling a bag that the colour had already sold. One investigative reporter covering the Colombian Tusi trade put it precisely. Tusi is the Coca-Cola of drugs. The product inside the bottle changed, but the bottle was always the point. Coca-Cola removed the cocaine from its recipe in 1903 and kept the name. The brand survived. Tusi never had a consistent recipe to remove. 20 years after Alejo Tusibi added food dye to a powder in a Medellin apartment, because it looked better that way, the thing he made is in nightclubs on 4 continents. He is not. Alejo is somewhere in Mexico, according to the best available intelligence from investigators who lost his trail around 2010. He's protected by a man known as Alfonsito. After that, nothing confirmed. The drug kept his name, Tusi, Tusibi, the phonetic rendering of 2CB, the compound his product was supposed to contain and almost never did. The drug kept his pink colour. The drug kept the identity he built around it. Exclusive, European, sophisticated, not quite identifiable. The drug is in 17 countries. Alejo is not in any of them, as far as anyone can confirm. This is, in its way, the most honest summary of what happened. A man created something, and the thing he created outgrew him immediately and completely, and went on to become something he never intended, and something larger than he had any mechanism to influence or control, or even observe. The thing took his name. The thing took his colour. The thing left him behind. And the thing kept going. It is still going. It will keep going. The colour is pink. The notebooks are in California. Neither of them is going anywhere. And somewhere in a city you haven't thought about in this context, in a nightlife scene where nobody has built vocabulary for it yet, someone is producing a small bag from a jacket. The bag is pink. The night is just getting started.